Did homosexuality really exist in the Mongol Empire? Or is it just a modern myth projected onto history? The Mongols were feared as ruthless conquerors, masters of war, and rulers of the largest land empire ever known. But beneath the clash of swords and thunder of hooves, there were private lives, intimate bonds, and whispered rumors that the official chronicles chose to ignore, or deliberately hide. Were some of Genghis Khan's warriors bound together by more than just loyalty to the empire? Could affection between men have been both a strength in battle and a scandal in the court? What we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about life on the steppe. Drop a comment with the time you're watching this. I love seeing our global history community. And if you enjoy fearless history, told without censorship, subscribing is your choice. But you'll want to hear this. You feel the wind first, sharp dry, and carrying that faint tang of horse sweat and wood smoke. The steppe stretches in all directions, like an ocean of grass, broken only by the occasional rise of a low hill or the distant shimmer of a river. Out here, nothing stands still. The herds move, the yurts move, and people learn to move too, in body and in thought. In a life so open to the elements, you'd think everything is open to inspection, but not quite. Some things, the most personal things, find their own corners of secrecy, tucked away between the folds of daily survival. You notice how even the most talkative herder can suddenly become vague, evasive, when certain topics drift too close. The Mongol Empire didn't exactly hand out privacy in neat little parcels. Families lived in close quarters, tents could be dismantled in under an hour, and news traveled with the speed of a galloping messenger. Yet oddly, that same restlessness, the constant movement made room for certain feelings to exist without becoming everyone's business. If a pair of riders preferred each other's company a little more than average, the endless grazing lands gave them excuses. A plenty, scouting the herd, checking water sources, hunting. The wide horizon could be as much a hiding place as it was a stage. You can almost picture it now. Two young warriors racing side by side, horses pounding in rhythm laughter, tumbling into something quieter when they finally slow. Out here, with the sky pouring down like a dome of light, you can speak truths that might shrink under the scrutiny of a crowded court. And because Mongol society valued skill and loyalty above most, else a deep bond, no matter its shape, could be quietly tolerated if it produced reliable allies. Friendship could be more than friendship, without ever being labeled, so long as no one thought it threatened the clan's stability. Of course, you have to remember that this was a world built on alliances. Bloodlines mattered, heirs mattered, and marriage was often a transaction between families. That meant any personal inclination outside of those duties stayed in a realm of don't ask, don't tell centuries before that phrase was ever coined. People became experts in subtlety. A certain glance while dismounting a shared tent on a long journey, things that meant nothing to the unobservant, but a whole conversation to those who knew. The climate helped keep secrets too. Winters could freeze you to the bone, and even spring gusts cut through the felt of the yurt walls. In those long, cold nights, sharing body heat wasn't just comfort, it was survival. Who lay beside whom didn't always spark comment, so long as it was framed in the language of practicality. It's not that feelings didn't exist. They simply weren't recorded the way political treaties or battle victories were. The steppe didn't run on parchment, it ran on memory and rumor. And rumor, as you might expect, was a tricky thing here. On the one hand, gossip could ruin you. On the other, the nomadic web of kinship and movement meant a story might vanish over the next ridge, replaced by fresher intrigue. A wandering bard might sing of a great hunt and slyly mention two who could never part, leaving listeners to guess at the meaning. Such hints could be dismissed as poetic exaggeration or not. It all depended on who was listening and how badly they wanted to hear scandal. You wonder, how would such relationships survive under these conditions? The answer lies in the very structure of Mongol daily life. The camp was a fluid thing, swelling and shrinking as groups joined or split. Families and warriors could be reassigned to different leaders, especially if a Khan suspected trouble or if someone too curious started asking questions. That constant reshuffling created both risk and opportunity. One month, you might be separated from the person you trusted most. Another month, you could find yourself riding beside them again for weeks at a time. The unpredictability was maddening, yet it was also the cover that allowed private bonds to keep breathing. Think about how this contrasts with later, more sedentary empires. In a palace, everyone knows who sleeps, where, who visits whom, and which corridors are suspiciously busy after dark. On the steppe, with its rolling horizon and unmarked trails, you could vanish into the grasslands for hours, and no one could prove what you'd been doing. It's almost ironic this land with no walls may have protected certain intimacies better than any stone fortress. Still, the Mongol world was not a modern liberal paradise. Kinship obligations loomed large. Every man and woman had a role in strengthening the tribe, and breaking those roles openly could invite trouble. But you notice there's a difference between breaking and bending. The unwritten code of survival sometimes left just enough space for bending, so long as outward appearances stayed intact. Publicly, one fulfilled duties: herding, fighting, marrying, producing heirs. Privately, a different current might run beneath the surface unnoticed, unless someone went looking for it. Even in the most macho settings, raids, hunts, wrestling matches, emotional closeness wasn't automatically condemned. In fact, Mongols valued deep loyalty between warriors, and any relationship that fostered that could be seen as a strength. History gives us countless examples of military cultures where bonds between soldiers went beyond camaraderie, and the steppe was no exception. The difference here was that the steppe left fewer records, so what survived is a patchwork of hints, foreign observations, and oral tradition. As you listen to the wind pushing at the yurt walls, you get the sense that so much of life here existed in that in-between space, visible but unspoken, ordinary, yet quietly defiant. And perhaps that's the point. In a society where everything could change with the next sunrise, holding on to something personal, something yours alone, might be the most daring act of all. You wake to the muffled clink of horse tack and the low hum of voices outside the yurt. The air inside is warm from the night's fire, but you can already feel the cool draft slipping in through the door flap. Outside, preparations for another journey are underway, and you notice how quickly the talk turns not to love, not to desire, but to marriages and alliances. In the Mongol world, marriage wasn't a matter of waiting for romance to strike like lightning. It was more like a chess move made carefully to strengthen the family, the clan, or even the entire confederation. A Khan's daughter might be promised to a rival son, not because they'd exchanged longing glances over fermented mare's milk, but because that union could keep two powerful families from tearing each other apart. Sometimes the bride and groom barely knew each other before the ceremony, and sometimes they didn't particularly like each other after. But in a political landscape as volatile as the steppe, liking someone was never the point. Stability was. You can almost hear the conversations, elders leaning over low tables, mapping out family trees in their heads, like battle plans. If we give her to them, we secure grazing rights in the east. If he marries her, we can cross the riverlands without tribute. Feelings. They didn't enter the equation unless they happened to align with political need, and even then they were secondary. You might wonder how anyone managed personal happiness under such a system. But here's the twist. Those same marriages often left space for other quieter relationships to survive in the background. Imagine a nobleman with a spouse chosen for him, living in a large household where duties kept them apart for much of the year. He rides with his own retinue, sleeps in different encampments, and spends weeks on military campaigns. Such separation leaves gaps where personal attachments, including those that fell outside societal expectations, could exist without causing much disruption. As long as public duties were met, marriage intact, heirs produced, the rest could remain in the hazy category of private life. This wasn't unique to the Mongols. Many ruling classes in history built their personal lives around public necessity. Take medieval Europe, for instance. Kings and queens married for alliances, yet the courts buzzed with unofficial partnerships. The difference on the steppe was mobility. Nobility here didn't live in immovable palaces. If you were a high-ranking Mongol, your household traveled with the seasons, meaning your inner circle could shift as quickly as the weather. The result? A world where your real confidant might not be the person in your marriage bed. You see this most clearly in how households were organized. The wives of powerful men often lived in separate encampments, each running their own yurt circle with servants' livestock and sometimes their own guard. These arrangements weren't just about domestic order. They were also a kind of controlled distance away to prevent power struggles among spouses. And when physical separation becomes routine, emotional separation can follow without much resistance. It's tempting to imagine everyone secretly yearning for romantic freedom, but in reality, many people simply accepted the system as it was. That doesn't mean feelings didn't exist. It just means they adapted to fit the structure. The beauty of Mongol pragmatism was that so long as the political machine kept running, what happened in the quieter spaces of life could be quietly ignored. Of course, sometimes the arrangement backfired. If private attachments started to influence public decisions, say, favoring a certain ally in negotiations because of a personal bond, then the gossip would begin to churn. And gossip in the Mongol court could be a dangerous thing. A whisper in the right ear could have you reassigned to the farthest frontier or conveniently lost in the chaos of a campaign. It was a reminder that the personal could survive in this system, but it had to know its place. Still, you can't help but think of the people who navigated both worlds successfully. They smiled at their arranged spouse during ceremonial banquets, rode out to inspect the herds with the clan, and fulfilled every public duty flawlessly. But in the quiet moments, after the speeches, after the duties, they might share an unguarded conversation, a lingering look with someone who truly understood them. Those private moments were not part of any treaty, but for the individuals involved, they might have been the only part of life that felt freely chosen. And it's here that the unspoken rules shine through public loyalty, private freedom. So long as one didn't cross the invisible line, where private attachments threatened the public alliance, no one felt compelled to go digging for scandal. In a way, It's a lesson in balance, one that's oddly familiar even today. Think about modern political marriages or celebrity partnerships built more on brand synergy than affection. The mechanics have changed, but the dance between public duty and private life remains surprisingly recognizable. You ride with the column, now the rhythm of hooves thudding in your chest as much as your ears. The wind whips your face, and the smell of leather sweat and dust is constant. Out here, in the space between battles and the next distant settlement, you begin to notice something about the way these warriors interact. Mongol soldiers live in one another's pockets, sharing the same tents, eating from the same pots, watching each other's backs in combat. Bonds here aren't polite handshakes. They're forged under the kind of pressure that makes people trust one another with their lives. And sometimes that trust runs deeper than most are willing to name. You can see it in the way two riders exchange a grin when they think no one's looking, or how one soldier will instinctively check his friend's saddle straps before his own. The camaraderie is woven into every movement, but some threads gleam a little brighter, warmer. In the constant closeness of camp life, affection and loyalty can blur into something that neither side would label outright, but both would understand. The Mongol military was famously organized into decimal units, groups of 100,000, and so on each living training and fighting together for years. In practice, this meant the same faces around every campfire, the same voices in the dark after a raid. In such an environment, strong attachments didn't just happen, they were inevitable. And here's the thing. As long as those bonds made the unit stronger, no one much cared about their exact shape. The battlefield rewards unity, not conformity of feeling. It's not unlike certain elite military groups in more recent history. Think of World War II paratroopers or Cold War submariners, men isolated from the rest of the world, reliant on each other for survival. Over time, the line between brother-in-arms and something more could grow faint. And in many cases, the military culture simply avoided looking too closely. The Mongols, for all their fierce discipline, understood that human connection could be a weapon in itself, one that kept men from breaking under pressure. Around the fire at night, you hear laughter rolling through the camp, the kind that starts loud but settles into low murmurs between pairs or small groups. This is the Mongol version of a bar. At closing time, the crowd thins and the conversations grow quieter, more personal. Someone might share a skin of arag with only one other person, their heads leaning close, their talk lingering on stories instead of strategy. The privacy is minimal, but out here, privacy is more about the unspoken agreement not to intrude than about physical walls. Of course, the dangers of these bonds went both ways. If two warriors grew too attached and one was killed in battle, the survivor might take reckless risks, for revenge jeopardizing the unit. Commanders knew this, and they walked a fine line between encouraging loyalty and preventing dangerous fixation. Still, there are tales sometimes from foreign observers, sometimes preserved in oral tradition, of warriors whose connection outlasted even death, their loyalty celebrated rather than shamed. You think of one particularly telling account from a Persian chronicler describing Mongol troops who would rather die together than retreat separately. The chronicler doesn't speculate on the nature of their bond. Perhaps he didn't dare, but the admiration in his tone suggests he saw something beyond mere discipline. For the Mongols, whose entire system was built on mutual reliance, such devotion was the highest form of honor, no matter its origin. The days on the road are long, but the soldiers make them bearable for each other. They share inside jokes, tease each other over missed shots with the bow, and in the quiet moments, exchange words too soft for anyone else to hear. These relationships, whatever their boundaries, were sustained by the very structure of Mongol life: constant travel, constant proximity, and the ever-present need to rely on your closest comrade for your own survival. And here's a curious thought. Did the Khans themselves know, or even quietly approve? In a way, it wouldn't be surprising. Leaders like Genghis Khan valued competence and loyalty over conformity to some moral script borrowed from foreign courts. If two warriors fought harder because of their closeness, then perhaps that was simply another tool for empire building. The stars come out over the steppe, and you watch the camp settle into a rhythm of sleep and watch shifts. Somewhere nearby, two soldiers lie shoulder to shoulder, sharing the same heavy blanket. No one comments. No one needs to. In a world where the cold can kill you and enemies can strike at dawn, it's not the label on a relationship that matters. It's the certainty that when the charge sounds, someone will be at your side. What happens when whispers travel faster than the hoofbeats of a royal courier? You see it in the flicker of glances at the great Khan's court, where a single raised eyebrow can carry more weight than a written decree. The steppe might be endless, but in the royal encampment, where power and ambition gather under richly decorated felt roofs, privacy is a rare and fragile thing. Here, every movement is watched, every word measured, and the lives of the elite unfold like plays in which everyone thinks they know the script. Servants slip between yurts, not only carrying food or messages, but also snatches of overheard conversations. A nobleman's hand lingering just a little too long on another's shoulder might pass unnoticed in a crowded camp, but in the Khan's inner circle, it could set a story in motion. And when that nobleman happens to be a favored companion of the ruler, the smallest gesture becomes something people will discuss in low voices. Historical accounts from foreign visitors, Persian scribes, Chinese envoys, even envoys from distant kingdoms hint at the same patterns. They describe certain courtiers who seem to hold the Khan's ear more often than others, sharing private counsel, or receiving gifts and honors that went beyond the ordinary. Whether these relationships were rooted in political calculation, personal affection, or a mix of both, they drew attention simply because they altered the balance of influence. This attention could be double-edged. On one hand, the closeness to the Khan could bring immense rewards: fine horses' command of elite troops, or a seat in the most important councils. On the other, it could spark jealousy and rivals who might twist that closeness into a weapon. A simple comment like, "They seem inseparable, don't they?" could turn into a thread of suspicion, especially if the political climate was tense. In the wrong season, being too close to the center of power could be just as dangerous as standing too far from it. Yet in some cases, such bonds acted as a shield. If the Khan openly valued someone's presence and loyalty, they could survive storms that would otherwise destroy a courtier's career. The Mongols prized devotion and reliability, and once the Khan declared someone under his protection, that person's position became much harder to shake. In this way, the same connection that drew whispers could also serve as a kind of armor. Picture the scene inside the grand yurt carpets, woven with intricate designs, the air thick with the scent of roasted mutton and spiced tea, the quiet murmur of military plans being discussed. A favored courtier leans close to the Khan, speaking with familiarity that others cannot match. Around them, the rest of the court keeps their eyes politely lowered, though you can feel the undercurrent of curiosity. Did they share a private joke? Were they recalling a past victory? The truth may be simple, but in an environment where every glance is noted, meaning multiplies quickly. As the empire expanded, the court drew in people from many lands, each bringing their own ideas of propriety and morality. Customs shifted, and what might once have been overlooked in the old nomadic way of life could now raise questions among those from different traditions. These changing attitudes sometimes gave fuel to gossip, making personal relationships an easy target for those seeking to weaken a rival's influence. Still, those who thrived in the Khan's court learned to move with care. They knew which gestures to make in public, which alliances to display, and which moments to keep behind the heavy felt walls of a private tent. In a world where perception could be as important as truth, every action was measured like a move in a long game of strategy. Here, surviving the politics of the court meant mastering not only the art of war, but also the quiet battle of appearances. You step out from the hush of the royal tent and into the noise that really runs an empire, the market, where camels hiss, coins clink, and 20 languages overlap in a blur that sounds strangely like one song. Karakoram breathes around you, not as a single city, but as a crossroads that learned to stand still just long enough for the world to pass through it. Wool from the west, silk from the east, pepper from ports, you can barely picture all of it, arrives with stories, and not just the kind written in ledgers. Ideas travel too, slipping between bales of cloth and baskets of almonds, changing shape as easily as a merchant changes routes. You drift behind a line of Bukhara traders into a timber-fronted wine shop where the air hums with talk. Someone jokes that under the Mongols, even time pays a toll. Someone else answers with a proverb from Khorasan and gets a laugh. A musician plucks a short, warm melody on a dutar. A Chinese pipa answers from the corner with clear bell-like notes. If goods can mingle without quarrel, people try to do the same. The Mongol peace, the fragile calm, enforced by hard hooves and hard laws, lets caravans move and strangers meet. When strangers meet, they compare more than spice prices. They test customs against customs to see what survives the journey. At one table sits a scribe from Moraga, quoting verses that praise wine and the beauty of youth in the half-playful cadences popular in Persian courts. At another, a monk from the north reminds the room that vows exist for a reason, and that desire asks to be guided, not indulged. You catch the wink one trader gives another, and the carefully neutral smile a local headman wears, till the sermon ends. You realize you are watching something delicate, people negotiating a vocabulary for affection across borders that do not exist on the map. Persian literature brings in a set of metaphors, moon-faced youths, tulip-cheeked cupbearers that have circulated in cities like Nishapur and Isfahan for generations. The phrases land in this frontier air, with a soft thud of recognition for some bewilderment for others. You hear the words, but you also see the tactic admiration coded as poetry affection, framed as a conversation about beauty, not behavior. It is safer that way. You wonder, do you think beauty becomes less dangerous when it is spoken in couplets, or more? Across the lane, a Chinese clerk from the North Provinces recites a tale about actors and courtesans, the fine line between role and self, a line that blurs beneath painted brows and staged gestures. He does not preach. He describes, and description can be more unsettling than a sermon. because it refuses to tell you what to do with what you have just heard. On the bench near the door, a Turkic archer listens without comment, the bowstring around his wrist flicking once like a thought he decides not to finish. In the caravanserai, at dusk, conversations turn practical, as they tend to do after the third bowl of mare's milk. What will the tax be at the next river? Will the weather hold on the Gobi edge? But between the weather and the tariffs talk slips into the gray spaces that never make it to official scrolls. The wine seller in Samarkand, who never asks questions. The host in Tabriz, whose household is known for kindness and discreet rooms. The quarter in Kashgar, where musicians play late, and no one wonders why certain people always sit together. These are not confessions. They are coordinates, a soft map that runs beneath the hard one. Have you ever learned a city by asking where people feel safe rather than where the streets run? You remember what you heard in the court duty, first appearance firm, everything else arranged carefully behind it. Out here, the same logic holds only thinner, at the edges, where trade phrase certainty. Muslim jurists pass through with their books and their clarity. Buddhist teachers arrive with parables about desire's tether. Shamanic practitioners speak of spirit balance and the wrongness of excess more than the details of acts. None of these voices cancels the others. They form a chorus, and you notice that listeners pick the note they can live with. That more than any single rule is how daily ethics travel the road. A friar from the West scratches observations in a notebook by firelight, trying to square what he has been told with what he sees. He hears that some courts punish harshly, then spends an evening in a merchant's house where kindness governs the room, not decrees. He writes both lines because, like most travelers, he knows his readers prefer certainty, but his eyes keep showing him variation. Meanwhile, a secretary from the Ilkhanid administration copies a report in careful Persian names, weights distances, and slides into the margin a tiny note about a village where hospitality runs so deep the door is never latched. That little note will not change policy, but it will change a reader's picture of the road. In the middle of this, you notice what the Mongol system does best. It keeps the trade wind steady enough that difference can appear without demanding a verdict every hour. The empire wants taxes, paid roads, safe soldiers fed. If a caravan arrives intact, authorities smile with their eyes and stamp the papers. Within that umbrella, ways of speaking about affection, from Persian metaphor to Chinese theater gossip to Turkic hints, circulate and collide. For some, the new language offers cover. For others, it offers courage. For a few, it offers temptation they decide to decline. No one voice owns the outcome. By the time the moon lifts behind the low ridge, the wine shop has emptied, and the street smells of ash leather and boiled mutton cooling in wide bowls. You walk past a doorway where a pair of travelers share a joke too quiet for you to catch, and you think about how quickly a phrase can become a habit, how a borrowed image can help someone admit what they could not name yesterday. Trade does that, makes strangers into mirrors, then into teachers. You file away the faces and the tones of voice, knowing that ideas rarely announce themselves like caravans. They arrive hidden in the saddlebags of ordinary talk. In the women's quarters, the lamps are still lit, and you sense other conversations running on threads, just as fine ones that have less space in the market and more patience in the shadows. waiting for their hour to become audible. You find yourself at the edge of the women's quarters, a part of camp life that is both ordinary and invisible to most outsiders. Here the air smells faintly of felt warmed by sun, of dried herbs hanging from the tent poles of wool, being combed into soft piles for weaving. The hum of conversation is constant, but it flows differently than in the markets or the council tents. This is a space run by its own rhythms, its own politics, and its own understandings. Among Mongol women, alliances matter as much as they do among the men who ride to war. Wives of high-ranking men oversee entire households, manage herds, and direct servants. They are not cloistered away from responsibility. They are the engine keeping the domestic side of empire running. And in that engine room, relationships form under the same pressures as anywhere else: shared duties, shared frustrations, and the comfort of someone who sees the world from your vantage point. The domestic camp is not immune to secrecy. If two women form a bond that goes beyond companionship, they have an advantage the men do not. Their world is already partially hidden from male scrutiny. In the strict hierarchy of a Mongol household, the senior wife might oversee younger wives or female attendants, and it is within these nested circles that trust, sometimes affection, can grow quietly. Tasks like sewing, brewing, or preparing ceremonial garments give hours of close company unremarkable to onlookers, but rich for those inside the moment. Still, the opportunities are tempered by the weight of duty. Every woman in these circles is expected to uphold her family's honor, to serve her household's interests, and to produce and raise children if married. These expectations are heavy and non-negotiable. Any relationship that threatened them outright would be risky, not because it fit or did not fit a moral code in the abstract, but because it could upset the delicate balance of alliances between families. In the Mongol world, alliances were not just about politics, they were about survival. And yet, the daily life of these women creates countless unguarded moments. A long winter storm might keep the men away on a hunting trip, while the women share the same warmth of the central fire. A journey across the steppe might pair two women together in a wagon for days, away from the eyes of their usual households. These moments do not come with labels. They come as part of the fabric of life, where closeness is as much about necessity as about choice. Historical sources are sparse when it comes to women's private lives in the Mongol Empire, but absence in the record does not mean absence in reality. Women in many societies have found ways to communicate feeling without inviting the danger of public accusation. A shared song that carries an inside meaning, a gift of embroidery stitched with a pattern only one other person recognizes. These are languages that leave no incriminating witness, only memory. Some foreign visitors did notice the autonomy Mongol women enjoyed compared to women in other cultures of the time. A Persian observer once remarked with mild astonishment on the freedom of noblewomen to ride to manage property and to speak in council if the Khan permitted it. This freedom did not erase the hierarchy, but it did allow women to create spaces in which their own preferences and affections could find room to exist if discreetly. You also see the way women could be guardians of one another's secrets. A trusted attendant might shield her mistress from unnecessary questions, or a senior wife might quietly protect a younger woman from the gossip of rivals. Protection in this context was as much about controlling the flow of information as it was about offering physical shelter. In a society that valued reputation so highly controlling, The story was a form of power in itself. And so life in the women's quarters moves with a balance of openness and concealment. Outsiders might see only the weaving, the food preparation, the lullabies sung to children at night. But within these routines, women share glances, gestures, and words that bind them in ways that do not need to be spoken aloud. If the men's bonds are forged under the tension of war and hunting, the women's bonds are tempered in the quieter but no less demanding fires of shared responsibility. The moonlight spills through the felt roof, casting pale shapes on the ground. Somewhere, two women laugh softly. Over a private joke, the sound muffled, but warm. No one else asks why. In this world, not every truth is for public hearing. Some are meant to live in the warmth of the tent between those who have chosen to keep it. What happens when the law simply says nothing, and that silence ends up protecting you more than 1,000 rules ever could? The Mongols had their yasa, the great code said to come from Genghis Khan himself. It laid out how to punish thieves, how to keep the army in line, how to treat envoys, even how to respect different religions. But when it came to private relationships outside of marriage, the surviving records don't really say a word. That quiet isn't a gap, it's deliberate. The yasa was designed to keep the empire strong, not to meddle in every corner of a person's life. If something didn't break alliances, weaken the army, or cut into the empire's wealth, it rarely became a public problem. In that way, Mongol law was both firm and flexible, hard as stone. Where order was at risk, soft as leather. Where it wasn't, picture a council meeting in the Khan's camp. Elders and generals lean over a low table debating stolen horses, or a soldier who deserted his post. But if someone brings up a private matter, something personal that doesn't threaten the survival of the tribe, the tone changes. There's a pause, a shrug, maybe a quick change of subject. To the Mongols, stability of the whole came before moral judgment on the individual. That's not to say it was the same everywhere. In some corners of the empire, influenced by Islamic law, stricter punishments might be enforced. In other areas ruled directly under old Mongol custom, the silence of the yasa gave people more breathing room. The same act could be ignored in one place, but condemned in another, depending on who was in charge and what cultural traditions shaped the local laws. Foreign visitors often noticed this. A Persian official might be shocked to see a governor dismiss a case that would have been punished harshly back home. A Chinese chronicler could expect leniency, and instead watch a sentence handed down according to imported rules. The Mongols weren't bound to a single moral system. They chose the approach that fit their needs in that moment. For someone whose relationship didn't fit the usual marriage model, this meant survival depended less on the written law and more on reading the room. Keep your duties, strengthen your alliances, and don't give rivals a reason to point fingers. That was the real rulebook. If you had the Khan's favor or the protection of a powerful ally, you could live as you pleased, so long as it didn't rock the political boat. Of course, silence was not the same as full acceptance. The lack of a law could be a shield, but it could also be a gap an enemy might use against you. Without a clear rule to defend you, your fate could rest on the mood of a commander or the reach of your friends. In a border town, under stricter rule, discretion was survival. In the Khan's traveling court, loyalty and skill might make your private life invisible to those in power. In a way, the Yasa's silence created a hidden map across the empire, a map where safe spaces existed not on paper, but in the personalities of leaders, the customs of regions, and the strength of personal bonds. Navigate it well, and you could live untouched. Misstep, and you could find yourself at the mercy of someone who saw your private choices as an opportunity. By the end of the day, the scribes roll up their scrolls, and the camp settles into evening. No new laws have been announced. No punishments have been made public. The Great Code remains, as it was silent on what happens between people when duty is done. And in that silence, life continues, quietly hidden in the folds of the Empire's vast moving tent. You wake to the low sound of a drum and the faint smell of juniper smoke curling through the camp. Today isn't about war or trade, it's about the spirits. Religion in the Mongol Empire was never just one thing. It was a moving mix of shamanic rituals, Buddhist chants, Islamic prayers, and in certain regions, even the steady tolling of Christian bells. Under the great tent of the empire, belief was as varied as the languages spoken on its roads. In the older nomadic tradition, the shaman's role was central. He or she could speak to the spirits, ask for guidance in battle, bless a journey, or heal a sickness. In matters of personal conduct, the shamans tended to focus on balance, on keeping a person in harmony with the world of the living and the spirit realm. Excess dishonor or betrayal of trust were seen as dangerous because they unbalanced the web of life. But they rarely made moral judgments the way some settled religions did. Instead, they might tell a person to make an offering, avoid certain foods, or travel to a sacred site to restore harmony. As the empire expanded, the Mongols encountered Islam, Buddhism, and Christianity on a scale they had never seen before. Each brought its own views on love, marriage, and intimacy, and those views could differ sharply. In Muslim-majority regions, local rulers and judges might enforce laws based on the Quran, making certain private relationships risky. In Buddhist areas, monastic leaders often preach detachment from desire, altogether seeing it as a root of suffering. Christian missionaries, especially from the Nestorian tradition, emphasized the sanctity of marriage and family life as a divine order. The Mongols' genius was not in forcing one belief to dominate, but in letting many coexist under imperial protection, as long as those beliefs didn't threaten the Khan's authority. You can picture a royal court, where a shaman burns herbs at one end of the tent, a Buddhist monk recites sutras at the other, and an imam delivers a quiet reminder of God's law just outside. The Khan listens to them all, weighing not just their spiritual advice, but also how their words might shape loyalty among their followers. For individuals whose relationships didn't fit into the mold favored by any one faith, this religious variety could be both a blessing and a trap. In one province, the local shaman might shrug at the matter, advising only that you keep the household in order. In another, an imam might declare it sinful, and the law might agree. In yet another, a Buddhist abbot could speak of compassion, but still urge a life free from such attachments. A traveler crossing the empire would quickly learn that the same choice could be met with tolerance in one camp and condemnation in the next. Even so, the Mongols valued the role of religion in maintaining order, and they granted certain protections to religious leaders and institutions. This meant that spiritual authorities could influence local attitudes often more than the central law did. A well-respected monk or shaman could set the tone for a whole settlement's way of thinking about personal conduct. Have you noticed how in any community The person people turn to for blessings often shapes the unspoken rules. The steppe was no different. At the same time, the Mongols themselves were not quick to let religious teachings override practicality. A commander might nod respectfully at a sermon, but still keep a trusted companion close regardless of what the sermon implied. A merchant might listen to the imam's words on morality, then quietly keep his personal arrangements unchanged. Faith shaped the ideals, but life, especially nomadic life, had a way of bending ideals to fit reality. As night falls, you see the camp dotted with small fires, each one a circle of belief. At one, a shaman tells a story of the sky spirits. At another, a monk speaks of the path to enlightenment. At a third, a mullah recites the words of the prophet. Somewhere, a pair of friends sit outside the glow of any fire, speaking quietly under the stars. Around them swirl the many voices of the empire's faiths, none of them speaking directly to the choice they've made, all of them shaping the world in which that choice survives. You feel the ground change beneath your horse's hooves, grass giving way to the dusty road leading into a foreign city. The banners above the gate aren't Mongol. They're the colors of a place conquered not long ago. This is what the empire does best. It doesn't just win battles, it absorbs worlds. And with those worlds come new customs, new habits, and new ideas about how people should live and love. In one city, you might find narrow lanes, lined with wine shops, where poetry is recited freely and admiration for beauty. Male or female is spoken without hesitation. In another, the streets are shadowed by mosques, whose imams preach strict codes for personal conduct, making certain behaviors a punishable offense. Move again, and you might find a temple courtyard where monks speak of detachment from desire, entirely urging a life of discipline and restraint. For the Mongols, who came from the wide-open steppe, where the Yasa's silence often ruled these shifts, could be both fascinating and bewildering. When the Mongols conquered new lands, they rarely replaced every local custom with their own. Instead, they built a kind of layered authority, Mongol oversight, on top local rulers or governors beneath. This meant that local attitudes toward personal relationships often stayed in place, at least at first. A soldier stationed far from home could suddenly find himself living under a set of rules completely different from the ones he grew up with, rules that might frown on something his own people ignored. It worked the other way, too. A merchant from a conservative town might travel along the Silk Road and encounter communities far more relaxed about affection and companionship. These encounters didn't just change how people acted, they changed what people imagined was possible. Have you ever noticed how seeing something accepted in another place can make it harder to believe it should be forbidden at home? That's how ideas spread quietly, one conversation at a time. Some of the most intriguing exchanges happened at the elite level. Mongol envoys sent abroad sometimes returned with more than maps and treaties. They came back with tales of courtly traditions that wove admiration and affection into diplomacy itself. Persian poetry, Chinese opera, even Byzantine banquets, all carried coded ways of expressing bonds that went beyond the purely political. In some cases, Mongol nobles adopted these customs, folding them into their own social life. A gesture learned in one court might turn up months later in the Khan's tent, its meaning altered just enough to fit Mongol sensibilities. Of course, not all encounters were smooth. The same diversity that enriched the empire could also create friction. A governor influenced by Islamic law might look harshly on relationships that a shamanic elder back on the steppe would ignore. A Buddhist abbot might object to the public display of affection common in certain foreign markets. These differences could spark quiet conflicts, especially when they involved high-ranking figures whose personal lives drew attention. Yet the Mongols, with their focus on loyalty and service, often treated these cultural clashes as matters to manage, not moral crises to solve. If a valued officer or trader was caught between conflicting local customs, the solution was rarely to remove them, it was to move them. A transfer to a more accepting post could resolve the tension without challenging the principle of local autonomy. Over time, the mixing of cultures created unexpected spaces for personal freedom. In cosmopolitan hubs like Samarkand or Karakoram, so many traditions overlapped that no single one could dominate completely. People learned to navigate by choosing the customs that suited them in the moment, blending the rules of different worlds into a private code of their own. As you ride out of the foreign city, the air changes again, its spice and stone giving way to the clean sweep of the steppe wind. You think about how every conquest wasn't just about land. It was about the quiet import and export of human habits. Some of those habits stayed in the markets and temples where they began. Others traveled home in the memories of soldiers, scribes, and merchants stitched into the fabric of the empire, like hidden embroidery, visible only to those who know where to look. What remains when history decides not to remember you? The Mongol Empire left behind chronicles of battles, decrees, and conquests, but for the lives lived quietly in its shadows, especially those that didn't fit the official mold. The record is thin, sometimes vanishing altogether. The power to write history was rarely in the hands of those living outside the spotlight, and when the writers had their own ideas of what was worth preserving, entire worlds could disappear between the lines. As the empire fractured and centuries passed, the diversity that once defined it began to blur in the stories told afterward. In lands that embraced stricter moral codes, memories of the looser, more pragmatic Mongol approach faded or were deliberately erased. In other places, later rulers reshaped the past to align with their own values, turning the Mongols into either noble champions of order or cautionary tales of chaos, depending on the lesson they wanted to teach. Neither version left much space for the quieter truths of how people actually lived day to day. This isn't unusual. Across history, relationships and identities that didn't match the dominant narrative have often been smoothed over or ignored entirely. Chroniclers and court historians chose what to write based on their patrons' approval, not on the fullness of reality. A court poet might praise the loyalty between two warriors without ever hinting at the nature of their bond. A merchant's diary might note a close companion on a long journey, but leave the affection between them locked away behind bland words, like friend or partner in trade. What survived then are fragments, suggestions in foreign accounts, hints in poetry, brief asides in letters. They're small, but they matter. A Persian historian marveling at the trust between two Mongol generals, a Chinese traveler remarking on the shared quarters of certain courtiers, a piece of embroidery passed down in a family with no explanation of its symbols. All these are tiny doorways into lives history didn't bother to name. The erasure wasn't always hostile. Sometimes it was simply the result of what was considered important. The Mongols were practical record keepers. They noted tribute troop counts and the terms of alliances. Private affections, unless they altered the flow of power, didn't make the list. Over generations, those omissions solidified into absence, and absence became invisibility. Even so, traces remain if you know how to read them. A story told in one province about two inseparable riders might surface slightly altered in another province hundreds of miles away. A verse that sounds like praise for a comrade's skill might to careful ears carry undertones of something more. These echoes survive because people carried them in memory, passing them along as part of the empire's oral history, even when they didn't survive on paper. It's worth asking yourself, what gets remembered in your own time and what gets left out? The Mongols built one of the largest empires the world has ever seen, and they did it by absorbing countless cultures. But even in such a vast system, some truths were considered too ordinary, too private, or too inconvenient to record. That doesn't mean they weren't there. It means the task of noticing them falls to those willing to look past the official stories. As you watch the sun dip over the steppe one last time, the wind carries no answer, only the rustle of the grass and the distant call of a rider heading home. Somewhere out there, in memories that never made it to parchment, are the missing details of how people cared for each other, how they bent the rules, and how they lived in the spaces history forgot to guard. And maybe that's the quiet truth, that the most human parts of the Mongol Empire survived, not in books, but in the lives they touched, even if no one wrote them down. You've just spent hours wandering through the hidden corners of the Mongol Empire, listening to quiet rumors in the royal camp, catching glimpses of secret bonds under the endless steppe sky-tracing stories that history tried to erase. You've seen the empire from the edges through the lives of people history barely named. But what if we shift our seat at the fire? What if instead of watching from the shadows, you stepped right into the center of it all? Not as a soldier, not as a courtier, but as the one who commands the armies, hears every report, and feels the weight of an empire on your shoulders. Now the yurts and banners aren't just around you, they're yours. Welcome to your life as Genghis Khan. The first thing you notice is the wind. It's not a gentle breeze. It's a restless, endless thing, carrying the smell of grass and horse sweat across a horizon that refuses to end. Your childhood is measured in hoofbeats and campfires, under a sky so big it makes you feel both important and insignificant at the same time. You're the son of Yesugei, a respected clan, chief of the Borjigin, which sounds impressive until you realize prestige out here is only as steady as the loyalty of men with spears. Every morning, before you even think of food, you check the horses. Their breath steams in the cold, and the frost clings to their manes like crystal embroidery. You learn early that a horse's mood can tell you as much about the day as the clouds can. Your mother Holin is the quiet force holding the yurt together. She knows which plants heal, which dry meats last through winter, and how to read the twitch of a neighbor's eyebrow before trouble arrives. You watch her barter with other women, her words calm but her gaze sharp. She teaches you that in the steppe, strength isn't only about the bow, it's also about timing your words. By the time you're old enough to hold a child's bow, you've also learned to gut a fish without tearing the skin, to lash a cartwheel so it won't wobble, and to recognize the sound of a wolf's feet on snow. Out here, every skill feels like it could save your life someday. Some days are playful, racing the other boys across the plains until your lungs burn, wrestling in the dust, daring each other to ride bareback through the river when the ice has only just broken. Other days are instructional in a way you don't choose. You see what happens when a rider falls in battle, drills the dust, swallowing them before the next horse comes pounding through. No one stops the exercise. You just have to learn not to fall. The elders tell you stories at night, tales of kings who united tribes and warlords whose names were spat as curses. You listen wondering which you'll become, if you'll become anything at all. There's a rhythm to life here. Spring means moving the herds to fresh pasture. Summer is for stockpiling food and practicing the bow until your fingers harden. In autumn, you watch the men discuss alliances over fermented mare's milk, their voices low but sharp as blades. Winter is the real test. The cold seeps into your bones, and every trip outside the yurt feels like stepping into a punishment. But it's also the season for long nights by the fire, listening to the wind shove at the walls, while your mother spins wool and your father sharpens arrowheads. Sometimes you wonder if other children live differently. What would it be like to wake up and not have to check if the water in the bucket froze overnight? To eat bread instead of dried curds that crack your teeth if you're not careful. But then you remember, this is the only life you know. And here comfort is not the point. Survival is. And not just survival with the kind of pride that makes other clans remember your name. Every skill you gain feels stitched into your muscles, every lesson in caution and cunning settling into your bones. When you fall asleep, it's to the sound of horses shifting outside the creak of leather, the low hum of your mother's voice. You don't know yet how fragile this balance is, how quickly a single act of treachery can pull the pegs from the ground and send your life rolling across the steppe like an untethered yurt in a storm. But for now, the wind is your lullaby, the grass your floor, and the endless blue your roof. And then one morning, you notice your father doesn't come back from a journey the same way he left. You're still young enough to think fathers are indestructible when the news comes. No one shouts it. Death on the steppe doesn't need theatrics. But you read it in the way the men dismount without meeting your mother's eyes, in the way she grips the tent flap until her knuckles go pale. Yesuge has been poisoned, they say. The Tatars gave him food laced with death, and it worked its way through him before he could make it home. You picture him in the saddle, fighting to stay upright, as the poison twists inside him, still pushing toward camp, because he knows every extra hour he rides is one less hour you'll be leaderless, and now he's gone. You don't get time to grieve the way you expect. The other clans smell weakness like wolves on a carcass. Without your father's authority, alliances dissolve faster than snow in spring. One by one, the families who once shared your fires pull up their tents and vanish over the hills. They take their horses, their weapons, and most of the food. What they leave behind is mostly what they can't carry, tools too heavy. Hides not worth hauling, scraps of meat already turning. You're left with your mother, your siblings, and a handful of loyal faces staring at the empty horizon where the rest used to be. The steppe isn't kind to orphans, and out here, orphan doesn't only mean losing parents, it means losing protection. Other tribes treat you like an easy target, now circling in to steal what's left. Your mother becomes harder overnight. She teaches you how to find roots under frozen ground, how to gut a marmot in minutes, how to spot the faint silver thread of a river under moonlight. There are no spare words anymore. Everything is instructions, commands, corrections. You realize she isn't being cold, she's making sure you live long enough to see the next summer. Food becomes a daily gamble. You go to bed hungry, more nights than not lying awake, while your stomach grumbles loud enough for the others to hear. The worst is when you catch yourself staring too long at the sheep, calculating which one could be spared. knowing that eating it now means less wool and fewer offspring later. Every decision costs something. You start to measure days, not by what you gained, but by what you managed to keep. Still, there are moments that sharpen you. A small band of raiders rides in one morning, confident you'll crumble. They don't expect your mother to rally every able hand women children, anyone who can pull a bowstring. You remember crouching behind a low ridge, the air full of dust, and the metallic taste of fear before loosing your first arrow in earnest. You don't hit anyone, but you don't run either. Later you'll understand that this is when people start seeing you not as a child, but as someone who can stand his ground. It's during this time that you start carrying your father's small iron blade everywhere. It's not much, just a simple knife, but holding it reminds you of who you come from, even if everyone else seems eager to forget. You hear the older boys whisper your new name with a mix of mockery and curiosity. Temujin Blacksmith, after the man your father captured before you were born. It's not a name dripping with glory yet, but you'll give it weight. Nights on the steppe are sharper now. The fires burn lower, partly to save fuel, partly to avoid drawing attention. You lie on your back in the yurt watching smoke curl toward the vent, and you think about how fast life turned. Just weeks ago, you were chasing foals across the grass. Now you're counting arrows and wondering which direction the next threat will ride from. There's no romance in this kind of survival. It's raw, practical, and often humiliating. But it's also where you start learning that humiliation isn't the end of the story. It's a phase you endure until you're strong enough to make someone else swallow it instead. You don't know it yet, but the loneliness of this time will leave a permanent mark. When you grow into a man who unites entire nations, you'll remember exactly what it felt like to be abandoned, to watch people turn their backs because you couldn't offer them something in return. And you'll make sure no one forgets that leaving you to fend for yourself was their choice. For now, though, the goal is simpler. Keep breathing, keep moving, keep the family alive, long enough for fortune or your own two hands to change. The steppe has a way of teaching you that survival isn't just about grit. It's about who will ride beside you when it counts. You're still too young to command anyone, but you begin to notice which faces turn toward you when trouble brews. That's how you first meet Jamuka, a boy close to your age, with a knack for making friends as easily as he breathes. You find yourselves in the same camp for a season trading stories, racing horses until dusk. There's an ease between you, the kind that makes you think you've known each other longer than a handful of moons. One night, over a fire whose embers seem to hold the whole world's secrets, you swear a blood oath and a sworn brothers. It's not just a childish pact. On the steppe, this binds you more tightly than most family ties. Of course, alliances out here are rarely sealed without a little ceremony. Your mothers exchange gifts, fabrics dyed in the deep reds that only come from long journeys to distant markets. The men nod approvingly, because two ambitious young riders making a pact is as much about politics as friendship. You don't think in those terms yet. You just know you found someone who will fight for you without needing a reason every time. But the steppe doesn't let even friendship stay simple. With each new season, the alliances around you shift like sand under hooves. You start meeting other boys your age during hunts, some with eyes bright with curiosity, others with the guarded stare of someone measuring your worth. A gift of dried fish here, a shared skin of fermented mare's milk. They're small gestures that say, I see you in a land where strangers can become enemies overnight. It's in these early bonds that you start to learn the unspoken rules of loyalty. Help someone feed his family during a lean winter, and he'll ride with you in battle years later. Betray him, and the story will travel faster than the fastest horse. You watch the older men closely noting how they greet each other, how a well-placed compliment can smooth over an old grievance, how silence can be more powerful than an argument. You file all of it away for later. One of your proudest moments comes during a joint hunt between your small group and another clan. The men flush out a deer, and in the chaos of arrows flying, you land a shot that brings it down. It's not the largest deer, but it's yours, and the nods you get from the older hunters tell you it matters. When you share the meat with everyone, your family Jamuka, even a few men who wouldn't have shared theirs, you see how generosity earns you something. Weapons can't. Still, the reality is never far away. Not all bonds will hold. You hear about old blood oaths, broken over disputes about grazing land or stolen animals. Sometimes it's not even about resources, just pride. A careless insult during a festival, a refusal to marry into the right family, and suddenly, yesterday's ally is tomorrow's raider. You start to wonder how many of these friendships will last into adulthood, and how many will turn into stories your enemies tell about the time Temujin wronged me. But for now, you and Jamuka ride the plains together laughing at the way your horses spook at marmots, or the way one elder snores so loudly he scares his own goats. You don't know yet that your paths will twist into rivalry and war. At this moment, under the endless steppe sky, the only thing you care about is the feel of the wind in your hair and the promise spoken in blood that you'll always stand together. The lesson is beginning to settle into your bones. Power is not built alone. Even out here, where the land seems endless and the people few your future depends on, who will still be at your fire when the night turns dangerous. And just when you think you understand the value of these oaths, life decides to remind you how quickly they can be tested. You wake up to the sound of unfamiliar voices outside the yurt. Low urgent, not the easy chatter of neighbors. Before you can fully sit up, a shadow fills the doorway, and rough hands drag you out into the cold. The air bites at your face, but the grip on your arms is worse. You recognize the men instantly. They're from a rival clan, and they're not here for trade. The smell of horse sweat and leather is thick around you as they bind your hands, ignoring your mother's shouts. Being captured on the steppe is different from how stories make it sound. There's no grand speech, no demand for ransom, just the sudden knowledge that you're not free anymore. They haul you onto a horse, tie you to the saddle, like a bundle of meat, and set off at a pace that jolts your bones. You try to keep track of the direction, counting streams and landmarks, but the constant jostling makes your thoughts swim. Every now and then, one of them glances back with a smirk, the kind that says they enjoy watching you try to keep your head up. They take you to their camp, where the smell of smoke and cooked meat makes your stomach ache in a different way. You're shoved into the care of a family that's not yours, given chores before you're even given food. The work is relentless, tending animals, hauling water, scraping hides until your fingers crack. At night, you sleep in the corner of their yurt, listening to the muted voices of people who don't see you as anything but property. And yet captivity teaches you something you wouldn't have learned otherwise. You start watching people's routines, noting who leaves camp, at what time, who drinks too much at night, who sleeps light, and who sleeps like a stone. You keep your mouth shut more than you speak, which isn't your usual way, but you realize words can be saved for when they matter most. The humiliation burns, but you turn it into fuel. There's a kind of patience that comes from knowing you can't win today, but you might win eventually. You start storing small details, like a squirrel hiding nuts, where the ropes are kept, which horse is the fastest, how long the guards linger at meals. And you keep your body strong even when the work is meant to wear you down. Each bucket of water you haul, each hide you scrape, you tell yourself, this is training. One evening, while the camp is distracted by a small celebration, you make your move. The ropes they use on you at night aren't as tight as they used to be. You work the knot with your teeth until it loosens, heart thudding so loud you're sure someone will hear. You wait until the nearest guard's head droops, then slip out into the dark, moving like one of those wolves you used to track in the snow. The cold stings your face, but it feels like freedom. You find the fastest horse, of course you've already decided which one it is, and swing onto its back. For a few terrifying moments, you expect a shout, an arrow, something. But the camp stays quiet. The only sound, your horse's breathing, and the pounding of its hooves. You ride until the stars blur overhead, until your legs ache, and the horizon finally feels like it belongs to you again. When you make it back to your family, they stare at you as if you've walked out of a ghost story. Your mother doesn't scold, doesn't cry. She just grips your shoulders, looks into your eyes for a long time. You realize she's checking to see if you came back the same person who left. You didn't. And here's the thing about being taken like that. It strips you of pride. Sure. But it also leaves you with something sharper than pride. You now know what it feels like to be powerless, to have no control over your own movements, and you never want to feel it again. That's the hook in your chest now. The promise that one day, the choice will always be yours. Freedom has a strange taste when you've had it taken from you. At first, it's sweet. Every sunrise feels like a gift. Every breath of the cold steppe air, a reminder you're not sleeping in someone else's corner. But quickly, that sweetness sharpens into hunger. Not just the kind that rumbles in your stomach, though there's still plenty of that, but the kind that gnaws at your chest, pushing you to reclaim more than you lost. You're no longer content to just survive. You want ground. You want respect, and you want enough strength that no one dares try binding your hands again. You begin with small raids, because on the steppe, reputation is built in increments. A few loyal riders' men, who either owe you favors or believe in your promise, gather at your side. You're not leading an army yet, more like a determined wolf pack. You choose your targets carefully, poorly guarded herds, storage tents, left unattended places where the risk is low, but the gain is visible. Every successful raid is both a meal and a message. Word spreads that Temujin isn't just back, he's dangerous. Your first real prize is a cluster of fine horses taken from a rival camp. They're faster, sleeker than most of what your people ride, and they feel like a step toward the life you imagine. You don't keep them all. Giving away a few to allies is its own kind of investment. Out here, generosity with loot is as strategic as sharp arrows. The steppe teaches you that leading isn't just about pointing and charging. It's about knowing when not to fight. Sometimes you spot an opportunity that looks tempting, but reeks of trap, and you pull your riders back, ignoring the grumbles. Later, When another group walks into that exact ambush, you notice those same riders glancing at you differently, less like an ambitious boy, more like someone whose instincts are worth following. As your band grows, so does your need for order. You can't have disputes over stolen sheep or who gets the best horse turning into blood feuds inside your own camp. You start laying down rules, not grand laws, just simple boundaries. No raiding each other, share water on the trail, respect the chain of command. They seem obvious, but in a world where loyalty can shift with the wind, even small rules feel revolutionary. One of your most daring moves is a night attack on a Tatar supply line. You've scouted them for days, waiting for the perfect moment when their guards are lazy with drink and their campfires burn too bright against the dark. The rush of the charge in that moment, hooves pounding boughs, twanging shouts, splitting the cold air sears itself into your memory. You leave with carts of goods, but more importantly, with proof that you can strike and vanish before your enemies even saddle their horses. Still, it's not all victories. You take losses in ambush here, a trusted man caught in the wrong place there. You learn the particular ache of counting who doesn't come back from a ride. And you learn how to face your men afterward, steady-voiced, even when the weight of each death presses on you like armor you can't remove. By now, you've started to understand that the steppe runs on two currencies, fear and loyalty. Fear can get you quick results, but loyalty, real loyalty, lasts longer. So you mix them carefully, letting the memory of your raids keep rivals wary, while your fairness with your own people binds them closer. You're not the biggest force out here, not yet, but you're becoming the kind of leader others measure themselves against. And as you sit by the fire one night, watching the sparks rise into the dark, you realize you're no longer chasing the life you had before your father's death. You're building something bigger, something that might outlast you if you can hold it together long enough. The raids have given you confidence, but they've also given you attention. And attention on the steppe is a double-edged sword. Some clans watch your rise with interest, seeing a potential ally. Others grit their teeth, remembering slights that may be real or entirely imagined. You start to notice the small gatherings that happen without you, the way certain men lower their voices when you pass. It's a reminder that the real battle isn't just fought with bows and sabers. It's fought in conversations you're not invited to. Uniting the Mongol tribes sounds noble when storytellers recite it years later, but in practice, it's a balancing act between politics, flattery, and the occasional well-timed threat. You begin with the smaller, scattered families who are tired of being bullied by stronger clans. You offer them protection in exchange for loyalty, and you make sure to actually deliver on it. When raiders come for their herds, your riders answer quickly, driving the enemy off, returning the livestock intact. Word of that reliability travels faster than you expect. Then there are the larger, prouder clans, men who have no interest in bending the knee to a young upstart. You meet them in neutral territory, where both sides eye each other's weapons as closely as they do each other's faces. You've learned that respect isn't always about winning the argument. It's about leaving the meeting without having given an inch in posture, tone, or intent. Sometimes that means swallowing your pride in the moment so you can make your move later when it counts. Not all negotiations are smooth. Once during a tense talk over grazing rights, an elder from a rival clan laughs in your face, calling you the boy who lost his father's people. You don't rise to the bait. You just remind him that you've gained more followers in 3 years than his family has in 3 generations. The room goes quiet, and though he pretends not to care, you catch the flicker in his eyes, a man realizing the old order might not last. You also start to see the value in symbolic gestures. After bringing one mid-sized clan into your fold, you arrange a massive shared hunt. It's not just about the meat, it's about showing your combined strength. Watching dozens of riders fan out across the plains working together instead of against each other, you feel the shape of what could be a single force, united under one command, able to take on anyone from the Tatars to the Jin dynasty. Of course, unity doesn't erase old grudges overnight. You hear about fistfights breaking out over the placement of tents or who gets first access to a water source. You deal with them swiftly, not with long speeches, but with decisive rulings that make it clear your word is final. Over time, even the more stubborn warriors begin to see the advantage in having a single authority. One of your smartest moves is promoting men from humble backgrounds if they prove themselves in battle or decision-making. It unsettles the old guard, who are used to leadership being decided by bloodline, but it inspires the common riders. They start to believe that serving you isn't just about serving a chief, it's about being part of a new order where merit matters. Still, every new alliance is a fresh gamble. You're tying your fate to people who could turn on you if they think it's in their interest. But the more threads you weave, the stronger the net becomes. And by the time the snows melt that year, you've gathered more riders under your banner than you ever thought possible when you were scraping roots from frozen ground. And one day, you realize that the boy who once relied on a handful of allies to survive now commands enough horsemen to cast a shadow across the horizon. You can hear them before you see them, drums the deep kind that vibrate through your ribs, and the low chant of riders calling your name. The air smells of horsehide sweat and the smoke from dozens of cooking fires. Somewhere, a shaman is burning juniper, the sharp, resinous scent curling into the wind like a signal to the spirits. This is not just another gathering of clans. This is the day you stop being simply Temujin and become the Great Khan. The hook is sharp in your chest after everything. The hunger, the exile, the raids, the alliances stitched together out of stubbornness and strategy. You stand at the center of a wide ring of mounted warriors. Their banners ripple like river grass in the wind. Every man here has chosen to ride with you, whether out of loyalty, fear, or the promise of greater spoils. And now they will all watch as you're crowned with a title that will either unite them for years or paint an even bigger target on your back. The ceremony itself is older than anyone here, but you know every step. You dismount before the shamans, the dust settling around your boots. They offer you the white mare's milk, its sour-sweet tang almost choking you as you drink a symbolic reminder of your bond to the people and the land. They lift a sable cloak onto your shoulders. It's warm, heavy, and feels like both an honor and a burden. Then comes the declaration. The shamans chant the words, naming you Chinggis Khan, universal ruler. The sound swells, echoing across the plains, and you can feel it vibrating in your bones. You look out at the gathered warriors. Some nod with solemn respect. Others grin with the thrill of what's coming. A few stare, calculating already, imagining how they might test you. It's fine. You've never been afraid of tests. The feasting starts as soon as the formalities end. Roast mutton ereg flowing like water voices, rising in songs older than memory. You move among the riders, clasping hands, trading words that are both greetings and subtle negotiations. A chieftain from the western clans tells you his people will fight wherever you point them if their grazing lands are left untouched. An archer from the east swears loyalty in exchange for the right to lead his own contingent. Every smile hides a bargain, and you keep each one stored away in your mind. What strikes you most is the scale. When you were a boy, a gathering of a dozen yurts felt like an event. Now you look across a sea of them, each with its own fire, each fire with its own story. You're not just leading men, you're leading their families, their herds, their hopes for a future where they won't be swallowed by stronger forces. And you know, the only way to keep this unity is to keep moving, to keep winning. At one point, you step away from the noise and stand at the edge of camp, watching the sunset spill gold across the grasslands. It's almost too quiet until you realize the sound you hear isn't silence. It's the low hum of a people at rest for now. You think back to the boy who came home from captivity, swearing he'd never be powerless again. That boy would never have imagined this moment. Still, you don't let yourself linger in nostalgia. The title you've just taken doesn't mean you've arrived. It means you've signed up for a fight that will never really end. From this day forward, every victory must feed the momentum. Every setback must be answered twice over. You can't just be the man who united the tribes. You have to be the man who keeps them united, even when the road stretches into foreign lands where no one speaks your language, and every fortress stands daring you to break it. For now, the firelight flickers across your new cloak. The voices of your people carry into the dark, and the drums beat on promising that tomorrow the whole steppe will know the Khan has risen. The drums are still in your ears when the real work begins. Coronation feasts are for showing unity. Campaigns are for proving it. The first targets are close rivals who refused your invitations to join, believing their isolation would shield them. You ride out with a column of horsemen so long that the dust cloud alone seems like an omen. The ground trembles under the weight of hooves, and the banners snap like whips in the wind. You fought before, but never with this many riders answering your signal. Deserts, rivers, mountains, none of it slows you for long. Your army moves with a speed that surprises even you, breaking the old rhythm of steppe warfare. You don't just attack. You plan routes that make your enemies think you're somewhere else entirely until you're already at their gates. When you take your first major fortress, it's not the walls that give you trouble. It's the sudden flood of decisions afterward. Who runs the place now? How do you feed people who aren't herders, but city dwellers with markets and fixed homes? You find yourself talking as much to merchants and stonemasons as to generals. Crossing into enemy territory becomes almost routine. You push through the Gobi with its cruel winds and sand that grinds into your teeth. You skirt the edges of the Jin dynasty's lands, where the cities glitter with tiled roofs and markets so crowded they make your steppe-born head spin. You take what you need and leave messages behind, not on parchment, but in the form of swift, decisive victories that warn others not to test you. One of your most famous moves comes during a siege where the enemy walls seem impenetrable. You order your men to cut off the city's water supply, then stage an orderly retreat just far enough to make them think you've given up. When they rush out to chase you, you turn and crush them in the open field. It's not just a win, it's a statement that your war is as much about the mind as the sword. But campaigns aren't endless parades of triumph. There are nights when the cold bites harder than the enemy, when rations run thin, and you have to decide whether to press on or pull back. There are moments when allies arrive late or not at all, forcing you to fight with fewer men than you planned. You start carrying not just backup plans, but backups for the backups, because the step doesn't reward those who gamble everything on a single throw. You also begin to see how war changes the people under you. Men who once followed you for loot now follow because they've seen the order you bring. They notice how your discipline keeps them alive, how you punish looting without permission, how you make sure supplies are shared, how you take responsibility when things go wrong. Slowly, the idea of Genghis Khan becomes something larger than you, a name that means victory to your followers and dread to your enemies. The scope of the campaign widens until the names of distant kingdoms become part of your daily conversations. Traders bring word of the Khwarezmian Empire far to the west, a place rich with cities and gold. Others speak of lands where the mountains spit fire and the sea never freezes. Each story stirs the same thought in your mind. If it exists, it can be reached. And if it can be reached, it can be taken. On the nights when the army camps, you walk among the fires, listening to the talk, boasts about the last battle speculation, about the next arguments, over the best way to season mutton. You keep your ear tuned for discontent, ready to address it before it festers. Out here, a grumble can turn into a mutiny if ignored too long. And always, just beyond the circle of firelight, you can see the dark horizon. It doesn't look empty to you anymore. It looks full of possibilities waiting to be ridden into. Conquest makes for thrilling stories, but holding what you've taken is the harder art. An army can take a city in weeks. Governing it takes years. You find yourself spending more time on rules than raids shaping a system that can stretch from the forests of the north to the deserts of the west without tearing apart at the seams. You start with what you know, discipline, and expand from there. Looting from your own subjects, forbidden. Taking livestock without payment, punishable. You make the rules clear, and you make the consequences clearer. Word spreads fast that the Khan's justice is swift, whether you're a shepherd or a noble. The yam system. Your answer to distance becomes a kind of lifeline for the empire. Relay stations dot the roads like beads on a string, each stocked with fresh horses and supplies. A rider can carry a message hundreds of miles faster than most armies can march. It's not just for military orders. Merchants use it too. And you know that making trade easier makes loyalty easier. The same stations that carry orders also carry news, and in a land, this vast information is as valuable as arrows. Taxation is another problem you can't ignore. You could demand tribute in gold or grain, but you've seen too many rulers drain their people dry and then wonder why no one defends them. Instead, you tailor demands to the land furs from the north, silk from the east, grain from the south. It's not generosity, it's strategy. A population that can still feed itself won't revolt as quickly. Your approach to religion surprises some of your allies. You don't care what gods your subjects worship as long as they pay their taxes and keep the peace. In your court, shamans sit alongside Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, and Christian priests. To outsiders, it looks like tolerance. To you, it's simply removing one more excuse for rebellion. If a man can keep his faith under your rule, he's more likely to keep his sword sheathed too. Of course, governing an empire means putting out fires, sometimes literal ones. In one city, a dispute between merchants escalates into street fighting. You send a small force not to crush them, but to separate the factions and force them to negotiate under your watch. It's the same principle you use to unite the tribes: stop the bleeding first, then talk about the cure. You also take care to reward merit. A young officer who shows cunning in battle might find himself in charge of a district, while a proven administrator could be moved to oversee a more troublesome region. It unsettles the old elites, but it sends a message to everyone else in the Khan's empire: ability outranks ancestry. Yet no system is flawless. Some governors take bribes, some generals grow too ambitious, and some allies forget who made them powerful. You can't be everywhere at once, so you rely on the loyalty of those closest to you, men who have seen you through exile, captivity, and war. But you also know that trust, like land, has to be defended constantly. The strangest part of ruling is how quiet it can be compared to the battlefield. Some days are nothing but lists, grain tallies, troop counts, tax reports. Yet even in that quiet, you feel the pulse of the empire. A caravan arrives from the far west, laden with spices you've never tasted. A letter reaches you in days from a city that once took weeks to contact. And every so often, a delegation arrives from a place you've never seen, offering gifts and pledging loyalty simply because the name Chinggis Khan reached them first. You've become not just a conqueror, but a keeper of what's been conquered. And you know that keeping it will require as much cunning and will as winning it ever did. The drums of war fade slowly in a man's life, but they never go silent. You're older now, the hair at your temples streaked with white, though no one dares say it aloud. Your body still moves with the strength of years in the saddle, but you feel the weight of the miles, the campaigns, the countless nights spent in tents, lit by a single lamp. The title of Great Khan hasn't loosened on your shoulders, it's only grown heavier. And yet, there's a strange calm to this stage of the journey. Here's the hook. This is the part the storytellers will turn into legend: the final years of Chinggis Khan. Not the boy abandoned after his father's death. Not the young rider with only a few allies, but the ruler whose word travels faster than any rider, whose banners have cast shadows over cities thousands of miles apart. The empire is vast now, stretching beyond what your younger self could have imagined. But the horizon is still pulling at you. There are campaigns, unfinished rumors of kingdoms farther west, seas you have never seen, fortresses that dare you to test their walls. Some of your advisors urge caution to settle into the role of statesman and let your sons take the burden of conquest. But you've never been a man for stillness. Even in your later years, you ride out with the army, the cold air in your lungs and the drumbeat in your chest. Yet the older you get, the more you think about what you'll leave behind. Not just territory, but the structure that holds it. You've built systems that can survive beyond one man, laws, postal routes, a culture of merit over birth. You've made sure your generals and governors are capable, even if it means they're ambitious. Ambition, you've learned, is easier to guide than laziness. You also think of your sons. They've grown into leaders in their own right, each with their own temper, their own circle of loyalty. You know they'll clash when you're gone. It's the way of powerful men. But you've set the rules of succession as clearly as possible, hoping to give them a map instead of a battlefield. Whether they follow it will be their choice and their test. There are moments in these later years when you're reminded of how far you've come. A trader from lands you've never stepped foot in bows, before you offering a gift in exchange for safe passage. A former enemy, now a loyal vassal, sends his sons to serve in your court. And once while riding through a village, you hear an old woman tell a child, "The Khan's law keeps the wolves away." You don't stop, but the words follow you for days. You're not immortal, and you know it. A fall from a horse, an illness in a strange land, any number of things could end you. But you've already outlived the expectations of everyone who thought the boy from the Borjigin clan wouldn't survive his first winter without his father. You've carved your name into the memory of half the known world. On cold nights, you still dream of the steppe as it was in your childhood. The endless grass, the bite of the wind, the sound of your father's voice. But when you wake, it's to the sound of an empire breathing in unison. You've given it shape, given it laws, given it a rhythm that might endure long after the hooves of your own horse are stilled. And maybe that's the legacy worth more than the gold, or the cities, or even the victories. The fact that the world will remember not just that you ruled it, but that you remade it. The boy named Temujin became Chinggis